On the afternoon of the 3rd of February 1998, a Polish doctor named Peter Strelczyk stood at the foot of a mountain in northern Italy watching his wife and son disappear slowly into the winter sky. The three of them had spent the day skiing together on Mount Cermis above the Italian town of Cavalese. It had been a good day. The snow was fresh, the weather was clear, and by mid-afternoon the slopes were still crowded with tourists enjoying the final runs of the day. But Peter's knee had started to ache. Not badly, just enough for him to decide he would sit out one final journey further up the mountain, while his wife Ava and their son Philippe continued without him. As the gondola doors closed, Peter waved goodbye. Then he watched the cable car drift gently away, until it became little more than a dark shape against the snow. Then he turned away. He never saw his wife and son again. Nestled deep within the Italian Dolomites, Cavalese is the kind of place that almost seems untouched by the modern world. Surrounded by forests and mountain peaks, the town had become one of Italy's most famous ski destinations by the late 20th century. Carrying many of those visitors into the mountains was a cable car system that the people of Cavalese had once feared they might never trust again. Because more than 20 years earlier, Mount Cermis had already witnessed one of the deadliest cable car disasters in history. On the 9th of March 1976, an overloaded gondola plunged hundreds of feet down the mountainside after a catastrophic failure high above the valley. 42 people died, including 15 children, while rescue crews climbed desperately through the snow towards the wreckage. Only Alessandra survived. For the people of Cavalese, the memory of that day never truly disappeared. Locals still remembered the twisted wreckage and the young cable car operator, Carlo Schweitzer, who would spend the rest of his life carrying the shadow of that day on his shoulders. The disaster haunted Mount Cermis for years afterwards. For a time, many questioned whether the cable car should ever operate again. But by the late 1990s, the people of Cavalese had begun to believe that whatever darkness had once hung over Mount Cermis belonged to another generation. The line was rebuilt in under 2 years. Safety systems were modernised. The old red gondolas associated forever with the horror of 1976 eventually disappeared, and newer, bright yellow cabins replaced them, gliding quietly through the alpine air above the valley once more. Slowly, tourists returned. Then thousands more. And over the next 2 decades, millions of passengers travelled safely up and down Mount Cermis without incident. Children who had not even been born at the time of the first disaster now skied the slopes themselves. And little by little, year after year, the mountain regained the trust it had once lost. By the late 1990s, the horror of 1976 had begun to feel distant. The mountain no longer felt haunted. To most people, it simply felt beautiful. And on the 3rd of February 1998, Mount Cermis looked beautiful. Fresh snow covered the slopes beneath the clear blue skies of the Dolomites, while skiers gathered outside cafes and lift stations preparing for the final runs of the day. Above the valley, gondolas moved silently back and forth, carrying tourists higher into the mountains above. One of the men working on the mountain that afternoon was 56-year-old cable car operator Marcello Vanzo. He had been born in the valley itself and lived in the small hamlet of Mazzi di Cavalese, only a short distance beneath the cable car lines. Mount Cermis was not simply somewhere he worked, it had shaped his entire life. Like many local people, Marcello had lived through the first Mount Cermis disaster, seen the line rebuilt, and watched the old red gondolas gradually disappear as confidence slowly returned to the mountain year after year. On the afternoon of the 3rd of February, he had not even originally been scheduled to work. After sharing lunch with colleagues earlier that day, Marcello agreed to swap shifts with another operator, unknowingly saving the other man's life. On most days, the atmosphere inside gondolas was calm. They glide gently above the valley, beneath the steady mechanical hum of the cable line. Some stared out through the windows at the stunning views, while others chatted quietly about the final run of the day. That afternoon, among them were Peter Strelchik's wife Ava and their son Philippe. Far away from the peaceful silence of Mount Cermis, another journey had already begun. At Aviano Air Base, around 60 miles away, a Grumman EA-6B Prowler electronic warfare jet belonging to the United States Marine Corps had taken off on a low-altitude training mission through northern Italy. Designed during the Cold War, the four-seat aircraft specialized in electronic warfare, jamming enemy radar systems and gathering intelligence during combat operations. Unlike conventional fighter jets, however, the Prowler had little ability to defend itself directly. Survival often depended on flying low enough through valleys and mountain terrain to avoid detection, making low-level training exercises an essential part of life for Prowler crews stationed in Europe. On board the aircraft that afternoon were pilot Captain Richard J. Ashby, navigator Captain Joseph Schweitzer, and two additional crewmen seated behind them, Captains Chandler Seagraves and William Rainey. Ashby was nearing the end of his posting and reportedly preparing for promotion. The flight was routine, at least it should have been. For years, local residents in northern Italy had complained about American military aircraft roaring through the mountains at dangerously low altitude. Jets thundered over villages and tourist resorts with enough force to shake buildings and rattle windows. To many Italians, particularly in areas surrounding NATO bases, the flights represented an arrogance that had slowly become normalized. And on that afternoon, the Prowler descended lower still. At around 3:13 p.m., Flight EZ-01 entered the Val di Fiemme at high speed. Pilots flying through the Dolomites were expected to follow strict altitude and speed restrictions designed to keep both aircraft and civilians safe in the narrow alpine valleys below. Although some standard Marine Corps training guidance permitted low-level flights as low as 1,000 feet, stricter Italian directives had reportedly already been issued for the Trentino Alto Adige region, following repeated complaints about military aircraft flying dangerously close to towns and ski resorts. In the area surrounding Mount Cermis, aircraft were expected to remain at least 2,000 feet above the ground. Exactly which restrictions should have applied that afternoon would later become part of the wider controversy surrounding the disaster. But whether the legal minimum altitude was 1,000 feet or 2,000 feet, investigators agreed upon one thing: the Prowler was flying catastrophically below both. At the moment it entered the valley, the aircraft was barely 360 feet above the ground. It was also travelling significantly faster than regulations permitted for low-altitude flight through the mountains. At that speed, the Grumman EA-6B Prowler tore through the Dolomites with terrifying force. Witnesses on the ground later described the jet roaring through the valley so low that it seemed almost level with the mountains around it. At some point during the flight, someone aboard the aircraft had begun filming using a personal camcorder. Exactly what that videotape contained would later become one of the most controversial aspects of the entire situation. Below them, the gondola carrying Marcello, Ava and Philippe and 17 other passengers continued in serene climb towards the ski slopes. The contrast between the two worlds could not have been greater. One moved gently through the mountains carrying families on their skiing holiday. The other tore violently through the valley as a machine built for war. And then, suddenly, the two paths crossed. Stretched across the valley ahead of them was the thick steel line carrying the gondola. Captain Richard Ashby reacted instantly, banking sharply left in a desperate attempt to avoid collision, but at the speed the aircraft was travelling there was almost no time to respond. The Prowler passed beneath the cable itself, while the right wing struck the steel support line with unimaginable power. Witnesses across the valley heard what many later described as an explosive crack echoing through the mountains. The cable was severed instantly. The gondola jerked violently before seeming to hang motionless for a brief and terrible moment. Then gravity took hold. The cabin plunged more than 80 meters down the mountainside. Inside there would have been almost no time to understand what was happening. The gondola hit the mountainside with devastating violence. Some victims were killed instantly in the fall, while others are believed to have survived the initial impact, only to be crushed beneath the collapsing remains of the cabin itself. There were no survivors. High above the valley, another gondola carrying only a single operator jerked violently to a halt after the cables severed. Suspended helplessly above the mountainside, he remained trapped for more than 4 hours while rescue crews climbed towards the wreckage below. As the afternoon slowly turned towards evening, he could do little except watch events unfold beneath him. According to later reports, the experience would leave lasting psychological wounds long after he was finally brought back to the ground. Meanwhile, inside the cockpit of the Prowler, the crew were suddenly fighting to keep the aircraft in the air. The impact with the steel cable had torn violently through the right wing, almost ripping it away from the aircraft altogether, while the vertical stabilizer at the rear suffered severe damage. Fuel streamed behind the jet as warning alarms filled the cockpit and hydraulic systems began failing one after another. For several terrifying seconds, the crew could not know whether the aircraft would remain controllable at all. Captain Richard Ashby pulled sharply upwards, climbing desperately away from the mountainside in case the crew were forced to eject. At the speed they had been travelling, there had been almost no time to process what they had struck. They knew the aircraft had suffered considerable damage, but not yet how serious the consequences on the ground had been. As the Prowler climbed away from Mount Cermis, the crew struggled to stabilise the aircraft while turning back towards Aviano Air Base. The controls had become dangerously unpredictable. Hydraulic fluid leaked from the damaged jet, while sections of the aircraft shuddered violently in the freezing air. Against the odds, the Prowler remained airborne long enough to reach Aviano. Even the landing itself was dangerous. Damage to the aircraft and landing gear meant there was no guarantee the jet would stay intact once it touched the runway. And yet somehow the crew brought the aircraft down safely. All 4 men survived without physical injury. The crew later claimed they did not initially realise they had struck a cable car. Navigator Joseph Schweitzer would later say they believed they had simply hit some form of wire crossing the valley. But shortly after landing, something happened that would haunt the case forever. That videotape had disappeared. Back on Mount Cermis, people were already racing towards the wreckage scattered across the snow. Rescue crews climbing towards the wreckage quickly realised there would be no survivors. Among the first people to reach the scene was 29-year-old local mechanic and volunteer firefighter Stefano Waldner. Just moments earlier, Waldner had been driving through the valley when he looked up and saw the aircraft strike the cable. He later recalled watching the cabin spin through the air before plunging towards the mountainside. When he arrived at the wreckage, the reality of what had happened became horrifyingly clear. The victims were barely visible beneath the twisted remains of the destroyed cabin. Among them was Marcello Vanzo, the cable car operator. Waldner knew him personally. The 2 men had lived only a short distance apart in the valley below. Years later, Waldner admitted that the images from that afternoon never truly left him. "It replayed in my mind day and night afterwards," he recalled. For the second time in a single generation, the mountain had become the scene of mass death. At the foot of Mount Cermis, Peter Strelchik had no idea what had happened. Somewhere high above the valley there had been a terrible noise, followed by confusion spreading rapidly across the ski resort as people turned towards the mountain. Then came the first rumours that something had happened to one of the cable cars. The same cable car carrying his wife and son. Just minutes earlier, Peter had stood watching Ava and Philippe disappear slowly while he remained behind because of the pain in his knee. It had seemed like such a small decision at the time. One final run missed. Nothing more than that. Now, somewhere beneath the snow and twisted wreckage high above the valley were his wife and child. And Peter could do absolutely nothing except wait. In the space of a few minutes, an ordinary family skiing holiday in the Italian Alps had become unimaginable tragedy. A sore knee had saved Peter's life. Father Renzo Casarotti, then parish priest of Cavalese, will never forget the moment he arrived on scene. The cable car cabin was crushed, blood on the snow, and a shocking silence. That scene haunted me for many sleepless nights. As news of the disaster spread across Europe, grief rapidly turned to anger. Not simply because 20 innocent civilians had died, but because they had died as the result of an American military training exercise carried out above a peaceful tourist valley. And soon investigators uncovered detail after detail that only deepened the outrage. The aircraft had been flying far below the legal minimum altitude. It had also been travelling well above the permitted speed limit for the valley. The crew claimed outdated military maps failed to show the cable car lines crossing the mountains. Yet investigators later discovered updated maps had in fact been issued, and one remained sitting inside the aircraft, still sealed in its original envelope. The crew also claimed a faulty radio altimeter prevented them from realizing how dangerously low they were flying. However, later examinations suggested the instrument had worked perfectly before and after the flight. Then came another revelation. Investigators discovered evidence suggesting the crew had been filming during the flight. A camcorder and the wrapper for a videotape were found inside the aircraft, but the tape itself was gone. Eventually, Joseph Schweitzer admitted he had burned it shortly after returning to base. According to Schweitzer, the tape merely showed crew members smiling and admiring the scenery during the flight. He claimed he destroyed it because he feared the footage would later appear insensitive if broadcast alongside images of the disaster. But there was a serious problem with that explanation. Schweitzer had previously claimed the crew did not know they had struck a cable car until after leaving the aircraft and being informed by a commanding officer. But investigators would later discover a detail that cast immediate doubt over that explanation. If the crew truly did not yet know a cable car had been struck, then why was there any urgent need to destroy the tape at all? Because by Schweitzer's own timeline, the recording had already disappeared before the crew were supposedly informed that 20 people were dead. To many Italians, it looked like evidence had been deliberately erased. Rumours spread rapidly that the crew had been recklessly joyriding through the Dolomites, performing dangerously low manoeuvres through the valleys simply for excitement. Some even suggested the pilots had deliberately attempted to pass beneath the cable itself to demonstrate their skill, though this was never conclusively proven. The destruction of the videotape only deepened those suspicions. The sense of outrage in Italy was enormous. Newspapers stopped referring to the event as an accident and instead called it a massacre. Anti-American protests erupted, while anger increasingly focused on the Italian government itself. Under NATO agreements, the American servicemen could not be tried in Italy. Instead, the crew were extradited to the United States. To many Italians, this felt humiliating. 20 people had died on Italian soil, and yet Italy itself appeared powerless to deliver justice. Italian prosecutors complained that the American crew refused to answer questions, and many arguments erupted over access to flight recorder data recovered from the damaged aircraft. US military authorities were also criticised for delays in handing over information to Italian investigators, something that only strengthened suspicions that the full truth about the flight was being hidden. Italian Defence Minister Beniamino Andreatta publicly insisted there could be no obstacles to uncovering exactly what had happened above Mount Cermis, while newspapers across Italy increasingly portrayed the disaster as far more than simply a tragic accident. For many people, it had become a symbol of American military arrogance operating above Italian soil. Some newspapers even linked the controversy to wider political tensions between Italy and the United States, particularly surrounding the extradition of far-left activist Silvia Baraldini. Whether fair or not, a belief spread among parts of the Italian public that diplomatic relationships mattered more than the victims of Mount Cermis. Eventually, Richard Ashby and Joseph Schweitzer stood trial in the United States on charges including involuntary manslaughter and negligent homicide. The defense argued the disaster resulted from confusion, faulty information, and technical problems, rather than deliberate recklessness. Prosecutors argued the crew had knowingly flown far too low and far too fast through a populated tourist valley. Then another devastating detail emerged. A confidential Marine Corps report later revealed that members of the crew had previously received warnings for flying too low during earlier training exercises. Yet despite everything, both Ashby and Schweitzer were acquitted of the deaths. The verdict caused fury across Italy. 22 years earlier, another man connected to Mount Cermis had spent the rest of his life carrying the blame for a disaster many believed was far larger than one individual alone. Now, once again, the mountain was left with grief, anger, and a growing sense that justice had somehow slipped quietly out of reach. Stefano Waldner, one of the first volunteer firefighters to reach the wreckage on Mount Cermis that afternoon, said he still found the outcome difficult to accept. "We all don't understand how the matter could be resolved so easily," he said. "These are things too big for us to comprehend." Protesters burned American flags, while newspapers condemned the outcome in furious editorials. For Peter Strelchik, the verdict was almost impossible to accept. His wife and son had boarded a cable car on a winter afternoon and never returned. Yet the men accused of causing the disaster had walked free. This was not an accident, he later told reporters. They destroyed the tape to hide the truth. "My family is dead, and the people responsible are walking free. There is no justice here." In the years that followed, Peter continued campaigning for accountability and remained one of the most vocal critics of the handling of the disaster, refusing to allow the victims of Mount Cermis to be forgotten. Photographs appearing to show Joseph Schweitzer smirking during proceedings only deepened the anger. And yet the legal story was not entirely over. The destruction of the videotape resulted in a second court-martial centered on obstruction of justice and conduct unbecoming an officer. This time both Ashby and Schweitzer were found guilty. The two men were dismissed from military service and lost future benefits. Ashby served several months in prison. Schweitzer served no prison time at all. But the disaster had long since grown beyond the boundaries of a criminal investigation. President Bill Clinton personally telephoned Italian Prime Minister Romano Prodi following the crash, reportedly telling him that he was heartsick over what had happened. Yet for many families mourning loved ones on Mount Cermis, apologies could never undo what had been lost. Eventually, compensation payments were made to the families of those killed, with relatives reportedly receiving around $1.9 million for each victim lost in the disaster. Even that process became controversial. Although President Bill Clinton promised cooperation following the disaster, there was significant political resistance in the United States over compensation payments. At one stage, the U.S. House of Representatives voted against approving funds for the victims' families, a decision that caused further anger in Italy, where many already believed the American military had escaped proper accountability for the deaths. In the end, international agreements forced the United States to contribute towards the compensation fund, but by then relations between the two countries had already been soured. For many people in Italy, compensation changed very little. Mount Cermis had already endured one catastrophe within living memory, and after the disaster of 1976, the line had been rebuilt, and over the following 20 years, trust had slowly returned to the mountain once again. Then, in the space of only a few seconds, another 20 people were dead. And perhaps the strangest irony of all was that 22 years earlier on this very same mountain, cable car operator Carlo Schweitzer had followed instructions, been found guilty for the disaster that followed, and was ultimately sent to prison while carrying the blame for the rest of his life. And now another man, carrying almost the same surname, stood at the centre of another Mount Cermis cable car disaster. This time, 20 people were dead. Carlo Schweitzer was found guilty for a catastrophe that most people thought wasn't his fault. Joseph Schweitzer was found innocent in a disaster many believed he was guilty of. Years later, Father Renzo Casarotti would describe Mount Cermis as a double wound. The first wound had been the disaster itself. The second came afterwards, when many people in Italy watched the trial unfold and felt that nobody had truly been held accountable for what had happened. But none of the trials, arguments, political disputes or compensation payments could ever change what Peter had lost. For years he continued searching for justice, determined that the deaths of Ava and Philippe and the other victims would not simply fade into history. Yet no verdict could bring his family home. On the afternoon of the 3rd of February 1998, he had watched his wife and son disappear slowly into the sky above Mount Cermis. He would never see them again. Now, this incident is truly shocking in isolation, but for it to be the second tragedy to befall this community within a 20-year period is absolutely staggering. Our condolences go out to the families of those who lost their lives. Despite the nature of the information, I hope you appreciated the way it was presented. I'll see you on the next one, and I'll wish you bye-bye for now.